Hello, I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein. Welcome to American Architecture Now. Today we'll be talking to Kevin Roche. Kevin Roche is one of the country's most prominent designers of corporate and institutional buildings. His distinguished body of work is celebrated as much for its discipline and restraint as for its continuing inventiveness. It's a pleasure to welcome you here, Kevin Roche. Let's review some of the facts of your life. You were born in Dublin some 60 years ago, studied architecture there, and eventually, nearly 35 years ago, you left home in County Cork to come to the United States. What prompted you to do that?
Well, I had graduated from the university at the age of 22, and I had worked in Dublin and London, and I reached the age of 25, and I was having a middle 20s crisis, and I didn't know what to do with the rest of my life, so I decided that I was going to live for another 45 years, and that I would divide that up in three parts: 15 years of study, 15 years of practice, and 15 years of teaching. You can see I was very naive. And so I decided to study with all of the leading architects in the world that I could find.
It came to you quite clearly. This is what you should do.
Flash of lightning, yes. And so I set about it and decided to start with Mies van der Rohe. And he seemed to me to be the most promising of the architects practicing at that moment in time. So I applied for entry into the school at IIT, and I was accepted, and that was the beginning of my 45 years. But I never got any farther than Mies as far as the tour of great architects.
What was it about Mies van der Rohe that most impressed you?
Well, he was a truly very great architect, and he had such an intensity about architecture. For him, it was a very serious art. And you see, working in England, it was, at that time, it was quite frivolous. People spoke of it as being fun. But with Mies, it was no fun. It was a very serious art. So in that sense, it was an interesting beginning to one's life in architecture, to have the sense that this is the most serious of all the arts and the one that we must spend the most effort and time with.
Apparently you must be attracted by people who take architecture very seriously, because you went from there to Eero Saarinen, who at the time was perhaps America's most successful architect. That was during the 1950s. How did you come to work for him so soon after arriving in this country?
Well, I came first of all to New York when the United Nations headquarters was being built, and I did work in a very junior capacity, in fact an office boy capacity on that for about a year, and then I subsequently met Eero and had an interview with him, and he was just beginning his independent career at that time. This was 1950.
How pervasive was the influence of his father, a distinguished architect himself and the founding president of the Cranbrook Academy?
It was, of course, very formidable influence on Eero and on all of the Cranbrook graduates, among whom were numbered Charles Eames and Florence Knoll and Harry Weiss and Harry Botoya, quite a very distinguished alumnus. But as to the influence on Eero, I don't know. It's hard to say. Eero was very much his own person.
What specifically was so inspiring about working with him?
Well, it was his approach to what is the nature of an architectural problem. He always began not exactly reinventing the wheel, but began at the beginning of the problem, the forces behind it. What are the elements which are bringing this thing about, and how can we use these forces to generate a building from them? I think the best and the most characteristic of Eero's buildings, the most characteristic of the way he worked, was the Dulles Airport, where he virtually invented a new airport type, a completely original idea, the idea of the mobile lounge, around which a whole airport was planned.
All that I read about you and in our conversations, I sometimes think that you have the holistic approach to architecture that the social and economic and other factors are as important to you as the aesthetics?
Well, very much so. After all, everything we do is, we are part of our society, we're part of our culture. We have a terrible responsibility in that what we do, we pass along to our children and our grandchildren. It is part of the future society. And if it isn't well done, and if it isn't the right thing to do, then you're leaving posterity with this problem.
I've heard that Saarinen was a slave driver, and no one was more driven than himself. What was it like to work there?
Well, of course, living in Detroit, there wasn't really much else to do except work. But we did work long hours, and we worked every day.
How long are long hours?
Oh, we started usually about 8:30, and it would go on 12, 1 or 2 in the morning.
Who else worked there then?
Well, there were quite a succession of people that went through the office. Bob Venturi did, Caesar Pelle, Gunnar Berkitz, quite a number of architects who have since become established in their own right. In early 1950, there really wasn't any place else to work in the United States. There was very little going on, for instance, in New York in 1950. Skidmore, Owings & Mills did have an office. They weren't doing very much. Chicago, there were a few offices. Mies, of course, was the very strong influence, and then Frank Lloyd Wright.
When Saarinen died at the age of 51, as his chief design associate, you inherited a number of unfinished projects. And what projects they were: the TWA terminal at Kennedy Airport, Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., and the CBS building in New York City. Did you make any changes from the original Saarinen plans when you took the projects over? When he died, which was September 1st, 1961, TWA shell was just in place. The very first catenary of the Dulles Airport was in place, just one single cable and one of the posts. St. Louis Arch had not been started. The Deere and Company headquarters had not been started. CBS wasn't really even finished in design. Bell Laboratories was just starting construction. So not only did he not see them completed, most of them he didn't even see in the early stages of construction. It was one of the great tragedies of his life that to be such an intense and such a creative architect, and to at the same time never have the pleasure of seeing anything of any of his major work completed. To the work and thinking of what other architects do you most respond?
In the modern times, of course, Alto, I think, is a remarkable architect. Wright, obviously, was the great American architect. Particularly his early work is incredible, just extraordinary. But I think there are many excellent architects, also younger architects today who...
For example?
Well, I wish you hadn't asked me that.
Well, I have.
There are many. There are Richard Meyer and Michael Graves and all of the people who are practicing in that are very, very good, very fine, very formidable architects.
Who do you consider to be among the most undervalued or overlooked architects?
The people who produce indigenous architecture, the ones that don't qualify to be architects at all, but really the ones who build. The journeyman carpenters of the 19th century, you know, the masons who build the small Greek villages, the masons who built the medieval towns, the masons who built central Sweden, central Stockholm, or any city, and those were the best of all architects.
Vincent Scully, as you know, our premier architectural historian, has described your designs as Irish-American, and I believe he said in the most eclectic sense, that the scale was pure grain elevator and the detail Dublin elegant. Is that a fair description?
Well, Vincent is, of course, a very romantic writer, so I wouldn't dream of qualifying his, his descriptions at all.
Well, do you think there's a national style and evidence in your work?
No, I think I feel that I'm very much an American responding to American problems. I fondly imagine I have an American accent, and I hope that I have fully involved myself in the American culture, so I really don't think of myself as being Irish at all.
Well, what about other historical influences, or in fact the influence of personal history?
I would say the influences really that I've had were from Arrow and from Mies van der Rohe, and beyond that I can't go any farther back. I have two hats. One is I'm a person, the other is I'm an architect, but I'm a person first, so...
And they are separable?
They are certainly separable, yes. You really can't make an architect. It's a creative act, after all, being an architect, and it is an art.
Are you suggesting that architects are born, not made? Then what's the best way to prepare a younger architect for work?
Teach them that what they are doing is building buildings for people. And so the first thing they have to understand is what their relationship to people is and what is it that people need.
I think that's an idea that's widely shared or widely held?
I don't know. I don't believe so. I don't believe so. Because the models that we use generally are those kinds of models that were developed by Ayn Rand with the fountainhead, you know, where the architect is this person who has the right to do anything, in fact, has the right to blow up the building if he doesn't happen to like it. Or we use the model of Frank Lloyd Wright, who is the eccentric genius. We need to train people to see and to understand that there is an environment and that they can influence and that they can do something about it and they can improve it, and that the architects can be the instruments in making that improvement.
I know that you've said, and I know what you mean when you say, that an architect must have a good eye. What do you mean when you say an architect must have a good ear?
Well, you have to listen. The point where you start is not what is your grand concept of what this thing ought to be. The way you start is you talk to the people who are ultimately are going to be left with this thing that you do.
Why don't we take a moment and talk about one of your long-term associates and tell us about John Dinkeloo.
When John was alive, we shared responsibility for the two parts of building, which of course are the program, design, the evolution of the concept of the building on the one hand, and then on the other hand the actual process of building it, the preparation of the final drawings and documents, dealing with the contractors, dealing with codes, getting it up in the air. And John handled the latter part, I handled the first.
How large is your office staff?
We have about 80 people, of which perhaps 65 are architects.
How do you manage to coordinate all those commissions? And from what I understand, your deep involvement with your own family and lots of kids, too.
Yes, well, we do have 5 teenagers, and that will keep you busy. Nothing else does. No, I love the challenge of change. I get bored very quickly. If I work on something for more than half an hour, I just have to get off and work on something else.
Really? Do you go from one project to another?
And I just keep going back and forth from one to another and do it that way.
Practically speaking, I understand the extensive use you make of models. In fact, 30 to 50 models are often used for a single project. Why are models so important to the process?
Well, for several reasons. One, of course, is most buildings, well, all buildings are three-dimensional, so that one should not design them in two-dimensional medium, I believe. You should design them in a three-dimensional medium, which is model building. From a point of view of organizing an office, it is very good because it allows a large number of people. Only one person can work on a drawing, but 10 people can work on a model. And you can create a three-dimensional image of the building, varying scales, change it quickly, move things back and forth, change the color, change the size, change the scale, and in which you can never do with the drawing. The drawings are too static.
One of the things that is unique about your office is the way that it is housed. A turn-of-the-century mansion, so to speak, in Hamden, Connecticut. When did you acquire those headquarters, and why did you choose that location and that way of working?
Well, it started when we were in Detroit. We were in Bloomfield Hills, which was, of course, a suburban area. And most of our work at that time was in the East Coast, in New York and in Washington and New Jersey. And so Aero decided to move the office east. And we were planning to move last week in August 1960, the week Aero died. People had already moved. Some people had already moved. Everything was packed in trucks, and Aero died. And so there we were on the road. We had sold our property in Bloomfield Hills, but so we made the move anyway, which turned out to be very good because to a certain extent it made a break with the past, and it also turned out to be good in the sense that little did we know that we were moving into the center of the corporate headquarter world in Connecticut, you know, where everybody suddenly started to move out into Connecticut. And so we were right there on the spot.
You say that there are some buildings which very clearly provide the opportunity to do some public good, such as the Ford Foundation building, which was essentially a headquarters building in which you provided an enclosed public space. It seems to me that that monumental enclosed garden preceded the current spate of office and hotel atriums. What gave you the idea for that innovation?
And of course, in the 19th century, it was a common thing to do. There are many buildings in the United States, hotels across the country that use the device of enclosing the courtyard. Brown Palace in Denver is a very good example. But it probably was one of the first of the ones in the post-war period to do it. The Ford Foundation was an interesting problem in New York in that the site could have produced a much larger building. However, the foundation could not build a building larger than the building they could occupy. So we had an absolutely unique opportunity in New York, is that we had a small building on a large site. And that doesn't happen anywhere else in Midtown.
And it will never happen again.
And will never happen again, of course.
Does the idea still seem as fresh and workable?
I think it is possible to use it in a way which would be very pleasant.
The car is an important part of most people's lives. Has it had a big influence on architectural design?
In Union Carbide headquarters, you can drive onto the floor where your office is and walk perhaps 100 feet, and then you're in your office, and the whole thing is dealt with in a way which is very comfortable. The cars are put out of sight. You arrive in an elegant and pleasant way. So, but it is a very serious issue, and we have not faced it in a way that it should have been faced.
Haven't you also placed automobiles at the top of buildings?
Yes, that is, of course, the COLISEUM. We have done that. I am very concerned about land use and the loss of arable land and the suburban sprawl and all of those things. And when we build in the country, I deplore the parking lot, which is both destructive of nature, it is ugly, it affects drainage, it is a terrible thing. We did a factory in Columbus, Indiana, where the workers drive onto the roof and they take escalators down into a little garden courtyard and then go to work.
Among your innovations is the use of a great deal of Corten, a kind of weathering steel. What do you especially like about that material?
Well, there are many things. First of all, it is the nature of steel to rust, and the beautiful nature of this thing, that is that it rusts to a certain point and then stops rusting. So you have the color which comes about from rust, which is a very beautiful color and has great depth to it, and works very well in wooded areas. For instance, if you put a weathering steel building in a wooded area, it fits in beautifully with the color of the tree stems and the tree trunks. So it's a very handsome material, and it requires no maintenance. It is relatively inexpensive.
Among your museum designs are the master plan and the new additions to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You did that between 1975 and 1982. Tell us about your commission there and what programs and precedents, givens and limitations that you had to concern yourself in creating those spaces.
Well, I might say we're still working on it. We still have one more wing to go, which is hopefully going to happen very soon.
And what is that wing?
That will be for 20th century art. And we were called in to do a master plan which would reorganize all of the departments in the museum and establish gallery spaces, storage areas, study storage areas, curatorial spaces, and also organize all of the service elements. It all began to happen almost before we had the plan completed. Bobby Lehman came through with his collection. The Temple of Dendur was secured. And so all of the elements suddenly, I thought we started to do a master plan, but what it really turned out is we started to build a master plan almost before the plan was finished. So it happened very quickly.
Was that a good way to go about that?
Well, yes, because it enabled us to plan and build at the same time and make it could all happen. I felt very strongly that the move out onto Fifth Avenue had been a mistake, in a sense, that the original Olmsted plan for a building in the park was the right approach. However, there we had all of the Fifth Avenue facade, which was mostly covered up by a pretend park. So the first decision that we made was to take away the pretend park and make it into an urban setting, which were these plazas, the places to sit out, the fountains and the steps, which of course have proven to be very popular as people spaces ever since. And I felt that the kind of architecture which should go into the park really should be the kind of architecture one would expect to see in a park which is a botanical garden. That feels acceptable. So when it is all finished, which it is not now, when it is all finished and when all of the landscaping is in there and when all of the ivy has grown, you will see botanical garden buildings in Central Park which you will accept as being very beautiful. When you come out to Fifth Avenue, you will see the neoclassic buildings which you will accept as being urban buildings. So I've made a division in the museum between what I regard to be the urban or street facade and the park facade.
Your interest in the park has extended. A recent commission is for the design of a new Central Park Zoo, in which you're replacing some of the rather harsh buildings that date from the 1930s.
Well, let me make one general comment about the difference between designing buildings for animals and designing buildings for people. When you design buildings for animals, people are much more concerned about the living environment of the animals than they are about the living environment of people.
Where do you see architecture headed in the next decade?
I'm very optimistic. The future, at least the immediate future, holds for us a much better resolution of urban problems and a much better sense of how they ought to be addressed and a much better appreciation of what our environment, what our living environment ought to be and what the ideal conditions for life on Earth ought to be.
I wonder if you tell us why you have never chosen to design public housing.
I think the social problems related to adequate housing and employment are much deeper than can be solved by any public housing, and that's why I wouldn't care to get into it.
If you had it to do over again, what would you do differently?
I wouldn't know what I would do. I responded to all of the opportunities and constrictions which I faced in my life, and I really don't know that I could have done anything. Even if I tried, I probably couldn't have done anything any differently than I did it.
Would you have completed that world tour?
I'm glad I didn't.
So are we.